This broadcast is made possible by the friends and partners of LibertyNetwork.live. We thank you for your support.
Tonight we're going to be wrapping up our short section on Islam. I believe this is our fifth lesson. We did a session on the history of Islam. We did a session on the religion of Islam. We did a session on the wars of Islam, and then we talked about Sharia last week. And tonight we're going to be talking about the history of Islam in America. Next week we'll be getting back into Galatians, and from this point we will go ahead and finish Galatians, and then we'll decide where we want to go after that. Well, on the screen you see a photograph from 2009. This was Muslim Day in Washington, D.C., and you see thousands of Muslims there before the Capitol. And the unspoken meaning of all this is to a Muslim, once you've laid out your prayer rug, that territory belongs to you. So this is part of the process as they have a desire to bring the entire world under Allah. And of course, America is called the Great Satan, with Israel being the Little Satan. We are considered the biggest challenge to overcome. And Israel is, of course, the most inconvenient challenge, as the state of Israel is right in the middle of Muslim-occupied territory. But this is the goal, bringing the entire world under submission to Allah. Now, without any precedent to follow, George Washington, who was our first president under the United States. By the way, anybody know the name of our first president under the Articles of Confederation? Who is America's first president? Anybody know? I don't know why this just came back to my mind. John Hanson. First president under the Articles of Confederation. The first president of these United States under the U.S. Constitution is George Washington. Of course, the Capitol was in New York City at this time, and Washington, before taking his oath of office, asked for a Bible. And they had intended to have one there, and they didn't have one, but they ran and got one. And of course, Washington placed his hand on the open Bible, and after stating his oath, then he added the words, "So help me God," which were not scripted. That just came from his heart. Then he bent over and kissed the pages of the scripture, and that was the first oath of office for the first president of the United States. And in fact, that set the pattern for every president since then in taking their oath of office. But of course, he was able to take his oath to uphold the Constitution while placing a hand on the Bible, and there was not any conflict of interest in doing so. As we will enjoy next month, getting into the study of, as we honor Thanksgiving and honor the great faith of our pilgrims, Pilgrim forefathers, beginning in 1620 and all through America's history, we were built on the foundation of the laws of nature, of nature's God, which was a biblical worldview. As a matter of fact, Patricia Bonomi, who was a professor of history for New York University, in her own studies concluded that 98% of the citizens of the 13 colonies, when we declared our independence, were in fact Protestant Christian. And of course, as we have learned in past lessons, when we declared independence and the 13 colonies became 13 states, there was not one of the 13 states that you could serve in public office unless you proclaimed a biblical worldview and at least professed to be a Christian. And in many of the states, you had to be a Protestant Christian in your belief system. So this was very consistent, placing a hand on the Bible and pledging to uphold the Constitution, because they did not see that there was a conflict. Both held Scripture as the ultimate authority. But then, many of you may remember, back in 2007, for the first time ever, newly elected representative from Minnesota, Keith Ellison, who is now the Attorney General for Minnesota, he took his oath of office on a Quran. In fact, this was a Quran that was owned by Thomas Jefferson. And Speaker Pelosi, attempting to find some vindication for this mockery, made the statement that a visionary like Jefferson believed that wisdom could be gleaned from many sources. Of course, the liberal media lined up for the photo op and trumpeted the great day of multiculturalism here in America. It's just too bad that none of those investigative journalists actually thought enough to investigate the facts and find out whether Nancy was telling the truth or not, which we have we've discovered a way to know when Nancy is not telling the truth, and that's only when her lips are moving. But Thomas Jefferson was actually the first president to force the mobilization of our military against attacks by Islamic terrorists. In fact, this was Jefferson's copy of the Quran, true, but the primary reason that he had it in his library was for research about his enemy. Now, for America, we had won independence from Great Britain, and prior to our independence, the British Navy is who protected our shipping lanes and who protected our coasts. And of course, during the war, France came to our aid and protected our ships in the Mediterranean. But then after the war, France was no longer protecting our shipping, and Great Britain certainly was not protecting our shipping. And we had pirates from Islamic Barbary states that wound up of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Tripoli, plundering U.S. shipping by stealing our vessels, stealing the cargo, and then selling the sailors into slavery. And it wasn't just shipping. They would raid coastal cities, and there they would steal, treasure, and also men and women and children, make slaves out of them, raping some. And, of course, the men were made into eunuchs and sold into slavery or held for ransom. Unfortunately, for this period of time, America had no navy under President Washington or President Adams. Actually, President Adams is known as the father of America's Navy because our Navy was built while he was in office. But the first chance to actually use the Navy was when Jefferson, who was our third president, came into office. And prior to this, our only recourse for dealing with the pirates was to pay whatever they required to get our sailors home and get the slaves home. And in 1786, Congress wound up issuing a special commission to go and negotiate and find out why we were being attacked. This commission consisted of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. And in their discussions, they met with the ambassador of Tunisia. And the ambassador of Tunisia explained this. The ambassador of Tunisia answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet Muhammad, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim or Mussulman, as it's stated here, who is slain in battle would surely go to paradise. Well, for this some 18 to 20 years that this was going on, President Washington confided to his cabinet, would to heaven that we had a navy able to reform these enemies to mankind and to crush them into non-existence. And again, for this entire period of time, the American government paid these four Islamic nations millions of dollars in order to secure the safe passage of American ships and the return of American hostages. However, even with the extortion payments, it was not a certainty that the Muslims would honor their agreement because we were, in fact, infidels. So they were under no obligation to honor an agreement between an Islamic nation and a nation made up as infidels because we were, in fact, just that, infidels according to them. As a matter of fact, one of the statements that they made about the Americans is that we were a, quote-unquote, a feeble sect of Christians which only motivated them to attack us more and to extort more. Well, by the year 1800, the payments in ransom and tribute amounted to 20% of our annual budget and was in the many millions of dollars. So by the time Jefferson was elected president, we had the Navy in existence, and he determined that the only way to achieve peace with these nations was through, as he says in this quote, the medium of war. So did Thomas Jefferson own a Quran? Yeah, you bet he did, but not because he was open-minded, some open-minded visionary and was interested in converting to Islam. But after dealing with Islamic terrorism for nearly 2 decades, he knew that he needed to understand the mind of his enemy. So he had dispatched the United States Marines, and they were sent into action for the first time on foreign lands, supported by the newly formed American Navy. Consisted of the USS Constitution, the Constellation, the Philadelphia, the Chesapeake, the Argus, and the Siren, and the USS Intrepid all saw action. And of course, in 1805, the Marines marched across the desert from Egypt into Tripoli, forcing the surrender of Tripoli and freeing all the American slaves. And of course, the opening line of the Marine Corps hymn even today says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, We fight our country's battles on the land as on the sea. So, yes, America does have a long history with Islam, but as you have seen, it has not been a history of partnership. It was a history of war and oppositions. Now, as we've talked about these past several weeks, we know that the teachings of the Quran and a biblical foundation are at polar opposites. So by allowing this representative, Keith Ellison, to swear on the Quran just further deteriorates our foundation as a free republic and takes us one step closer to compromise and to their stated goal of implementing Sharia law around the world and even across the United States of America. And as we've talked in past weeks, we've seen the explosive growth of Islam after Muhammad's death. Of course, Muhammad conquered all of Arabia in just about 10 years. After his death, Islam spread across the Middle East, conquering the Holy Land and going into North Africa and even into Spain. And at the height of the Muslim world, what was called the Golden Age of Islam, their control extended from as far east as the Philippines to as far west as Spain. And as Joshua talked about a few weeks ago when discussing the wars of Islam, they were literally knocking on Europe's door in 1683 when they were defeated by a coalition of Christian armies led by King John Sobieski of Poland. And from that point in 1683 until World War I, Islam began to recede. In fact, between 1700 and 1900, they were driven out of Russia, they were driven out of Greece, they were driven out of India, they were driven out of Spain, they were driven out of North Africa, and then after World War I, out of the lands known as Lebanon and Israel and Syria and Iraq and Jordan. By the way, you notice the sign up here. This building no longer stands, but it used to be an Islamic center just a couple of blocks east of the governor's mansion here in Oklahoma City. It's now been torn down and replaced. But I'm glad I got a photo of this years ago because you notice it actually accurately interprets this phrase, Allahu Akbar. Now, we're always told, and I'm sure will again, that Allahu Akbar means God is great or Allah is great, but that is not what it means. Kabir in the Arabic means great. Akbar means greater or greatest. And as we've talked about in past week, when Muhammad was preaching his message, he went to his own people, the Arabs, and said, there's only one God but Allah, and I'm his prophet. There's no one greater than Allah. And they said, no, we don't think so. We believe in polytheism. He went to the Jews and said, Allah is greater than the God of the Jews. And of course, they had rejected that. And they went to the Christians and said, Allah is greater than Jesus, and Allah is greater than the God of the Christians, after they actually forced the Christians to either recede or submit. So the expression Allahu Akbar is a victorious chant, meaning Allah is greater than your false pagan gods. I should have put it in here, but I've got many quotes from Islamic clerics and scholars around the world that acknowledge and admit that the God that we worship is not the God that they worship. So we are going to be taught that. In fact, many of this gibberish is something that CARE puts out, that we all worship the same God. That is absolutely not true. And as we talked about the history of Islam and the religion of Islam, I tried to build a strong argument that the Allah of Arabia was actually the moon god. And I am convinced that it was, and that is the reason they have the crescent moon and the star, or actually Venus, as their Islamic symbol. That was the same symbolism of the ancient god Sin, which was the moon god. So I believe that was the connection there. Now, the question after Islam had been driven back, and you see the extent of their empire. In fact, again, it went all the way to the Philippines and covered the doorstep of going into Europe. And now they were beaten back. So by the time of World War I, when the last caliphate that was in existence, so understand, from Muhammad up until 1918, there was an Islamic presence in the Middle East, and they called it a caliphate. That was their global empire, with the last headquarters being in Turkey, that being the Ottoman Turks. Well, they had aligned with Germany during World War II, and of course were defeated, during World War I, and were ultimately defeated. So all of that territory that they once had became sectioned out under the control of France and Great Britain. And even Turkey became westernized. But the question that was asked after World War I by Muslims was, how could Christianity ever overcome Islam? How could non-believers with an inferior religion actually gain control over true believers? And as we have talked about in past weeks, we looked at the life of Muhammad, whose life itself was a pattern for Islam. And you remember we mentioned the Battle of Uhud, which Muhammad actually had defended his position in Medina, but because he had greater loss of life on his side than the Meccan forces, he deemed that as a loss. And the explanation was it was Allah's displeasure for a lack of dedication or a lack of devotion to Allah. Well, that was the same conclusion that they came to after World War I. And as we talked about in past weeks, as Great Britain had been making efforts to establish a Jewish homeland, the first Islamic Palestinian terrorist was a man named Haj Amin al-Husseini. He led in riots and revolts and all sorts of issues across the Promised Land, causing Great Britain to slam on the brakes. And at this point in time, they had a League of Arab Nations that met on an annual basis trying to determine how they should respond. And of course, in 1928, they ultimately came up with the Muslim Brotherhood, but the reason for doing that was on the screen. They had believed that they must have lost their devotion or their dedication to Allah, so they needed to rededicate themselves. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood was birthed as a result of that, and their organization's Article 8 in their constitution says, Allah is its goal, the Prophet is its example or model, the Quran is its constitution, and jihad is its path, and death for the cause or for the case of Allah is its most sublime belief. I showed you this quote a couple of weeks ago. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, made this statement: "Is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its law on all nations and to extend its power on the entire planet." We also talked about in past weeks how Yasser Arafat, he was not even born in this area. He was actually born in Egypt, and he was the first Egyptian terrorist. We saw how the KGB actually recruited him and trained him and reinvented him and rebirthed him to where instead of being a terrorist, he was now marketed as a freedom fighter, trying to throw off oppressive occupiers of his land. Well, after 20 years of Yasser Arafat's antics, the Muslim Brotherhood was dissatisfied with his lack of progress and the fact that Western nations had actually exiled him to Tunisia. So with him being absent and their dissatisfaction with his progress, Hamas was actually instituted in 1987 as another outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, all of this was proven in court case called the United States versus the Holy Land Foundation, all the documentation, some of which I'll refer to tonight. But the primary purpose of Hamas was the destruction of the state of Israel, the creation of an Islamic global state, and also murder of all Jews on planet Earth, as Article 7 of the Hamas Charter states. Their goal is to eliminate all Jews. So when people say that they're just anti-Zionist, but they're not anti-Semitic, that is not true. They may be being deceived, but to be anti-Zionist is, in fact, anti-Semitic, as Hamas views it and Israel views it. Well, another 15 years later, in 1993, we saw the next change in this history of the Middle East and what's going on with Islam, as we are aware of. There were what was called the Oslo Accords, which was a peace agreement that was orchestrated by Bill Clinton. And understand, Yasser Arafat was in no position of authority at this point in time. He was in Tunisia. He was a non-factor. But the West decided to recognize him as the representative of Islam with whom to negotiate. So they brought him out of mothballs and negotiated with Israel and wound up coming up with a certain amount of a peace agreement that was called the Oslo Accords, which wound up recognizing Israel's right to exist for the first time. Now, according to the U.S. government, the Muslim Brotherhood at this point directed its Palestinian communities worldwide, including those in the United States, to carry out some mandate of response to this great, terrible thing that had happened from their viewpoint, the recognition of Israel as a state there in the Middle East. Well, in America, key members of what had been called the Palestinian Committee met at the Marriott Courtyard right by the airport in Philadelphia, October the 2nd, 1993. This was literally about 2 weeks after the Oslo Accords were signed. Primary purpose of their meeting was to develop a strategy to defeat the Israeli presence in the Middle East and to continue and improve their fundraising goals and political activities in the United States. They were really crafty. They did not know at the time, but the FBI was actually onto them and actually recorded this entire 2-day meeting. But they thought they were being crafty. They didn't refer to Hamas as Hamas. They referred to Hamas as Sama. They reversed the word. Nobody would catch on to that. That was incredible brilliance on their part. And they would refer to her as Sister Sama, thinking that we weren't smart enough to figure that out. Well, it was repeatedly stated in the meeting that the Oslo Accords had made it more difficult for them to win public opinion in the United States. They said the goal of Hamas was the destruction of Israel, and when Arafat had recognized their right to exist, that really made it difficult on them, because they had tried to say that we are resisting occupiers, but now, if Israel has a legitimate claim to the land, that they were, in fact, nothing but terrorists, which is what they were all along. And again, because the Oslo Accords recognized Israel's right to exist, they had to respond in some way. So among the quotations from the members at this meeting was this man, who is now in jail. He was sentenced to prison for 65 years. But he was the founder of the Holy Land Foundation. He said this, as recorded in this meeting in 1993 in Philadelphia. He said, "I cannot say that I'm Hamas. For the American organizations, if you're against peace, then that automatically makes you a terrorist." Well, no kidding. That would make you a terrorist. But the Muslim militants had to learn the art of politics here in the United States. They had to master playing the media, and also had to learn political correctness. So another one of the attendees, this same man, made this statement: "It does not benefit me to show to the American people that I am against the Oslo Peace Accords because I hate Yasser Arafat and I hate the Palestinian Liberation Organization." Instead of attacking the PLO in a direct manner, he said, what we need to do is stop alienating the Muslim or the Americans as we are trying to shore up the Muslims. In fact, one of the other speakers there, the man who wound up being the first chairman of CARE when it was established just about 6 months after this meeting, Omar Ahmad, we referenced him last week. He made this statement as recorded by the FBI: "If you want to talk to the Americans in a peaceful manner, a politically correct manner, then you lose the Muslims. If you address the Muslims frankly, as you would like to, it means to the Americans that that you're a terrorist and you're trying to just kill innocent Jews. If someone asks you if you want to destroy Israel, what are you going to say on TV? If you give an inconclusive response, which is like you didn't answer the question, someone will come to you and tell you that you have forsaken your principles." So they were between a rock and a hard place. They had to have some sort of presence and statement that would appease the Muslims that believed in destroying Israel altogether, but also play the political correct game of the Americans in trying to paint them not as terrorists, but as freedom fighters. Well, one of the necessary goals for America that they concluded was coming up with an ability to mold public opinion, in other words, media influence, to expand their fundraising efforts, and then also a way to influence Congress. Well, this gentleman, I call him gentleman, Abu Bakr, was reported as saying, "Current organizations, we may just be too Islamic. Let's not hoist a large Islamic flag, and let's not be barbaric talking. We will remain a front so that if the thing happens, we will benefit from the new happenings instead of having all our organizations classified and exposed." He went on to state that they were currently unable to work because all of us have become burned. All of our organizations are purely Islamic organizations. We should start right now and begin thinking about establishing alternative organizations whose Islamic hue is not very conspicuous. Then he states, "War is deception. Deceive, camouflage, deceive your enemy." Now, regarding a name for this new organization that they were coming up with, Abu Bakr advised, make yourself a big name and give it media twinkle. And there is no need for unfamiliar names like Al-Aqsa, which it refers to the mosque there in Jerusalem, or Al-Quds, which is an Islamic name for the city of Jerusalem, Al-Siqara, and all that stuff. And they followed this advice, and just a few months later, as a matter of fact, the following June, the Council on American Islamic Relations was birthed with a stated goal of enhancing understanding of Islam, encouraging dialogue, protecting civil liberties, empowering American Muslims, and building coalitions that promote justice and mutual understanding. Remember what Abu Bakr said a moment ago? He said, war is deception. They must deceive and camouflage or deceive their enemy. Now, CARE professes to fight for Muslim civil rights and is the first ones on the scene to holler Islamophobia if anyone dares look cross-eyed at a Muslim. But you remember last week when I shared with you the quotation of the first chairman of the Council of American Islamic Relations as he was recorded in the San Remo Journal. He said this, he said, Islam isn't in America to be equal to any other faith, but to become dominant. The Quran should be the highest authority in America, and Islam the only accepted religion on earth. Now let me ask you, if you were going to define something as being intolerant, wouldn't you define that as being intolerant? So Muslims that accuse Christians of being intolerant, that is not true. We should be. We should be dogmatic about what is truth and what truth is taught. However, we aren't. But Islam most certainly is. As a matter of fact, in all of my times in Israel, I have been free to teach the Bible anywhere. I can take my Bible out. I can have Bible studies in any property, anywhere in the nation of Israel, except when you go up on the Temple Mount or into Bethlehem or in some area that is now under Islamic control. In fact, we are specifically told by our guides, do not even expose a cross. If you have a cross on your necklace, make sure and have it hidden under your shirt. Do not take your Bible. You cannot have prayer on top of the Temple Mount, and you cannot, you cannot pray or have Bible study on top of the Temple Mount. So understand, there's not a lack of tolerance from Jews. We are free to do whatever we wish to do when we're there in Israel. However, when you go up on territory that's under Islamic control, that is where the tolerance stops. And there is no tolerance for anything other than Islam. Now, we all remember 9/11. Of course, we talked about that not too terribly long ago, how the world had drastically changed forever. But because the influence of CARE within our White House, President Bush immediately fell into line with whitewashing of history. As a matter of fact, just 6 days after 9/11, Bush made a speech at the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C., and he said this, the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war. And you remember, we spent the next 20 years fighting a war against what? Terror. Well, what's that? Who do you identify as terror? Well, that's just some general concept. But he would not admit that the war actually with the Islamists that seek to conquer the world, including crush every Christian that's on the planet. And of course, sadly, President Bush misled us greatly and caused great harm with his lack of a backbone. Now, from 2001, fast forward 3 years. In 2004, the police observed a woman in full burqa that was doing something unusual. You know, it's not unusual for us to take pictures when we're on vacation, but normally we take pictures of historic sites or pictures of our family or something along those lines. Well, what caught the police's interest about this woman in full burqa was that she was taking photographs and video of the bridge supports of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Well, that caused them to prompt an investigation, and her home was raided, and they found a hidden office in a sub-basement that belonged to her husband, Ismail el-Barassi, who happened to be a high-ranking member of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. and they found a cache of documents there which the United States of America used to build a case against Islamic terrorism, not only in America but around the world. But one of the most incriminating documents was what was called the explanatory memorandum for the group in North America. And on page 7, it documents the strategic goal for understanding the role of the Muslim Brother in his operations in North America. And it reads, and I quote, "The process of settlement is a civilization jihadist process with all that the word means. The Ikhwan, which is an Arabic name for brother or Muslim brother, must understand that their work in America is kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of believers so that it is eliminated and Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Without this level of understanding, we are not up to this challenge and have not prepared ourselves for jihad yet. It is a Muslim's destiny to perform jihad and to work wherever he is and wherever he lands until the final hour comes, and there is no escape from that destiny." Now, just to cross-reference, remember some of these quotes that we've already looked at. Omar Ahmad made the statement that Islam is not in America to be equal to other religions, but Islam should be the only accepted religion and the only line of authority over the entire planet. And of course, we referenced Muhammad Akef a week ago, who was the chairman of the Muslim Brotherhood in 2005, when he famously said the Muslim Brotherhood is a global movement whose member organizations, and remember that because we're going to come back to that here momentarily, cooperate with each other throughout the world based on the same religious worldview, which is the spread of Islam until it rules the world. Now, the defendants from the Holy Land Foundation were ultimately all found guilty and sentenced to prison. As I referenced, Abu Bakr was sentenced to 65 years in prison, and he is still rotting in jail to this day. But they were found guilty of raising and funneling over $12 million to Hamas. But the Holy Land Foundation was only the first in a long list of what consists of 246 yet unindicted co-conspirators to terrorism. So understand, this was supposed to be the beginning and not the end. This was the first case of state prosecution, and it was the largest judgment of terrorist financing ever in history, and it happened to be this group called the Holy Land Foundation. Now, among the documents that were found in El-Barassi's office there when they were searching his home, they found this list of their affiliate organizations. And among those that are listed are the Islamic Society of North America, notice number 2, the Muslim Student Association, the Islamic Medical Association, number 6, number 8, the North American Islamic Trust, which is the organization that owns the mosques and properties here in North America. But I want to point out that here in Oklahoma City, or actually in Edmond, we have one piece of property that's owned by that North American Islamic Trust. You see listed there, number 8. Again, Islamic societies are mosques that are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So if you drive past in Oklahoma City, you'll see the Islamic Society of Oklahoma City. Well, that's their mosque. That is part of the Islamic Society of North America, number 1 on this list. You drive over by Edmond, you will see the Islamic Society of Edmond with a mosque operating right across the street from UCO and owned by the North American Islamic Trust, which is the group that owns all their properties. But notice that these are listed on this group of 246 unindicted co-conspirators to terrorism that are operating here in the United States. Now, sadly, in 2000, oh, by the way, I have a couple of quotes up here. Well, I'll come back to that in a little bit. Apologize for that. It is gross to be me, and I apologize for having to subject you to that. But among some of the other documents, of course, that were overwhelmingly incriminating, and all of these 246 other organizations were listed as to be prosecuted. But something terrible happened in 2008. I don't know if you remember what it was. Do you remember what happened in 2008? Obama got elected. Yeah, we had a guy named Eric Holder that was appointed as Attorney General and running the Department of Justice. And from that point on, all of these investigations ceased to exist at all. They have all been mothballed and never been resurrected. Now, CARE, recognizing that this was very bad for their image, decided to sue and have their name removed from this list of unindicted co-conspirators. However, the appeals court ruled against CARE, stating, you look in the upper part of this top paragraph, saying that the government has produced ample evidence to establish the associations of CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, all the mosques that start with Islamic Society of, the North American Islamic Trust, which we saw owns property and operates here in Edmond with the Holy Land Foundation, which the original organization operating in America was called the Islamic Association for Palestine, which became CARE, but all of these groups were proven in federal court to be affiliated with Hamas. And Hamas is a terrorist organization. So folks, we have groups that are affiliated with Islamic terrorism that are operating with impunity here in the United States of America, as we, being politically correct, refuse to ask any difficult questions or actually prod at all in this area or this conversation. Now, is it legit? Well, U.S. Attorney Gordon Kromberg was quoted in legal proceedings as stating, from its founding by the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, CARE conspired with other affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood to support terrorists. In fact, U.S. Attorney James T. Jacks, as a part of the Holy Land Foundation trial, said that CARE has been identified by the government as a participant in an ongoing and ultimately unlawful conspiracy to support a designated terrorist organization, a conspiracy from which CARE never withdrew. And of course, we had raised this argument some 15 years ago when there was discussions being brought before our city council about the expansion of the mosque there in Edmond. And of course, that was I was made a pariah from that. If you dared mention this obvious truth that's so well documented, you have to ignore it. You choose to be ignorant to ignore all of this that has been researched, historically proven, and proven in U.S. Federal court. The Edmond Sun, which was an operating newspaper at the time, actually did an investigation, and they reached out to the FBI and got this response. CARE has been advised of the reasons behind our suspension of former partnership, the FBI stated. These reasons include the fact that CARE was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the United States versus the Holy Land Foundation, and CARE's failure to answer our questions about a connection between their executives and Hamas. Until these questions are answered, the FBI does not consider CARE an appropriate partner for former liaison activities. And you know what has happened since that date until now? Absolutely nothing. There's been no further questions asked or answered. So we are still in this state of limbo, with the FBI recognizing that CARE is affiliated with Hamas. However, that's an impolite question to ask, so we don't ask it. Among some of the other documents that were found in El Barassi's basement were their phases of the World Underground Movement. Phase 1, discreet and secret establishment of elite leadership. They actually implemented this in America in the 1960s. Phase 2, phase of gradual appearance on the public scene and exercising and utilizing various public activities, and they have largely succeeded in this with CARE and some of the work that has been done, ironically, since 9/11. It's amazingly how that event opened the door to a working relationship and partnership between our federal government and the Islamists. Phase 3, the escalation phase, prior to conflict and confrontation with the rulers, utilizing mass media. I would say that we are still there at this point in time. The next phase being open public confrontation with the government through exercising the political pressure approach, and it notes that it is aggressively implementing the above-mentioned approach, training on the use of weapons domestically and overseas in the anticipation of 0 hour. It has noticeable activities in this regard. And then phase 5, seizing power to establish their Islamic nation under which all parties and Islamic groups become united, as stated by Muhammad Zain al-Abidin in his newspaper Al-Sana and Muhammad al-Aman al-Rashid. All the above phases are preliminary steps to reach the above-mentioned phase. Any of you know Brigitte Gabriel, who is a friend of our church? She's been here on several occasions. Of course, Brigitte grew up in Lebanon, was a Lebanese Christian. And you remember, in the Middle East, there had been divisions. Remember, after the last caliphate was thrown off in World War I, and Great Britain and France had responsibility for the Middle East, eventually, they were supposed to set up a Jewish state. And, of course, the first division, the first two-state solution, was the creation of Jordan in 1922. And Jordan was an Arabic or a Muslim state. The land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean was reserved for the Jewish people. Lebanon was actually created and was a majority Christian state. So I don't know if you've heard Steve Bannon this week suggesting that we divide up Israel 3 ways, with there being a Christian state and a Muslim state and a Jewish state. The Islamic state was already created. That was called Jordan. The Christian state was already created. That was called Lebanon. And then the Jewish state was supposed to be Israel. And, of course, now we've been trying to force Israel to give that property away. But understand, Lebanon was at one time considered the Riviera on the Mediterranean. It was a beautiful tourist resort. But over time, the Fatah moved up and had greater control of Lebanon until Lebanon eventually became an Islamist state. You read Brigitte Gabriel's biography or autobiography. She talks about that and how things changed, and these people that were Muslims that she thought were her friends, all of a sudden, one day with the flip of a switch, were no longer her friends. And they were, in fact, oppressed. In fact, she had to flee and go to Israel and ultimately came to America. And, of course, the rest is history. But the same is true in every situation. And why is this the pattern? Well, it follows Muhammad's life. When Muhammad did not have the upper hand, he strictly adhered to the message or the sermon, trying to sway people to follow him. Then, of course, he made his migration from Mecca to Medina, so Muslims now follow that pattern and move from Muslim states to non-Muslim states with the hope of spreading the message until you have enough people where you can finally have the upper hand. And at that point, when you have the upper hand, it's no more tolerance, it's no more peace, and it's no more sermon. At that point, it becomes the sword and forced submission to Allah, or you become in the dhimmi status, the slave status, or you can choose death. Another one of the documents was compiled and states this. These are points of the Muslim strategy: expanding the Muslim presence by birth rate, immigration, and refusal to assimilate. Notice that's what they admitted. They aren't coming here to assimilate. They're coming to settle North America, not to assimilate and become Americans. Occupying and expanding domination of physical spaces, ensuring the Muslim community knows and follows the Muslim Brotherhood doctrine. You want to know why there's no moderate Muslims? Because once the Islamists come into control, you are either an extremist or you are dead. You're an extremist or you're an other, which means a Christian, which would be an infidel, and a moderate Islamist is considered an infidel. Controlling the language we use in describing the enemy, ensuring we do not study their doctrine, co-opting key leadership, forcing compliance with Sharia at local levels. And by the way, what's going on now down in Plano area? This is where the argument is there. We saw years ago, decades ago, in Dearborn, Michigan, this was the argument being had. And now Dearborn, which has majority Muslims on their city council, has made, there's no such thing as noise ordinances anymore. You can have the Islamic call to prayer as early as 3 a.m., and you can't call and complain about it because they now have the upper hand numerically and are in control politically. Forcing compliance with Sharia at local levels, fighting all counterterrorism efforts, subverting religious organizations, employing lawfare, the offensive use of lawsuits and threats of lawsuits, claiming victimization and demanding accommodations. We certainly see a lot of that. Condemning slander against Islam. And as we noted last week, slander does not mean saying something false. Slander means saying something that could be damaging to their cause, which I'm committing slander right now because I'm telling you the truth about Islam. And anybody that happens to click on and watch this will be exposed to the truth. So I am guilty of slander and therefore subject to the death penalty according to Sharia law. Subverting the U.S. education system, in particular, infiltrating and dominating U.S. Middle East studies programs. That was one of the things that they discovered that they had to attack back in 1993 when they had this first meeting in Philadelphia. In the 1980s, most American professors were very sensitive towards the Jewish argument and very sensitive towards defending the Israeli right to exist. Well, what have you seen now in the last 50 years? What are we seeing this year on college campuses? Well, they've invested an awful lot of money from the Middle East oil countries into universities, establishing schools of Middle Eastern studies, all being indoctrinated with this belief system. And now when you go into a college campus, you see kids are not overwhelmingly defenders of Israel anymore, which 30, 40 years ago we were. As a matter of fact, American churches were. But now we are very much anti-Israel, anti-Semitic in every way. That is not by accident. That was by design. They invested money in the education system. They've invested money in our businesses and consequently have a substantial vote in decisions that are made in both. Demanding the right to practice Sharia in segregated Muslim enclaves, demanding recognition of Sharia in non-Muslim spheres, confronting and denouncing Western society, Western laws, and Western traditions, and demanding that Sharia replace Western law. Note that many of the foregoing techniques entail in one way or another influencing and neutralizing the American government at all levels. Now, in review, we talked about in past weeks that Sharia doesn't just come from the Quran. Of course, the Quran means recitation, and Muhammad, who was unable to read or write, but according to his testimony, an angel appeared unto him, and he was told to recite to the people what he was told. That, allegedly, is the Quran, the recitation. But then you add to that Muhammad's life, his actual life story and example, the things that Muhammad did also become part of Sharia, and then a consensus of Islamic scholars if there was a question. We talked about how his first 10 years he was very peaceful as he had the protection of his wife and his uncle in Mecca. And he was just an innocent or harmless philosopher as treated by most. And he was preaching his message to the Jews, to the Christians, and to his own people, the Quraysh tribe, and he was largely rejected by all. He literally had a non-existent following, but he had become an irritant. And after his wife died and uncle died, he no longer had protection. And either by force or by choice, he moved to Medina in 622. And at that time, he wound up brokering a peace agreement between two traditional warring Arab clans, and they became followers. All of a sudden, the peace-loving philosopher became a mob boss, as he now had muscle, and his tactics changed with the muscle. He began attacking trade caravans, which brought on war with Mecca, and again, things escalated, and as his forces increased, he wound up conquering Arabia. Well, we just mentioned what the Quran means. We talked about the important distinction, and this is something you need to remember, because a skilled Islamist will be able to take the Quran and go and show you how peaceful Muhammad was. And that is because for 10 years of his philosophical days, he was peaceful. In fact, he would encourage Muslims to go and talk to the Jews or Christians if they had a question about some of the things that he was telling them. In fact, he said that Jesus told him that they were to fear Allah and obey Muhammad. And then, of course, the famous verse that's misquoted, there is no compulsion in religion. And as I have stated on multiple occasions, the first 10 years of Muhammad's philosophy activity, he had no choice. He had no ability to force anybody to do anything. All he could do was say there is no compulsion in religion. However, after he moved to Medina, his tactics changed. The latter verses that came after the move replaced the earlier verses. And now you had what are known as the war surahs. Know that all of our booty that we may acquire in war, 20% goes to Muhammad, and you get to keep the rest. When you meet the unbelievers in a fight, cut their heads off and put them in bondage and subdue them. Remember, the Lord inspired the angels with this message, or encouraged angels with this message. I am with you. Give encouragement to the Muslims. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. Cut their heads off and cut their fingers off. And then Surah 8, fight them until there is no more unbelief, and the religion will be for Allah alone. And then Surah 9:5, kill those who join other gods with Allah wherever you shall find them, and seize them and besiege them, and lay wait for them with every kind of ambush. But if they convert to Islam, then they're okay. Or if they pay the jizya, or obligatory alms, as a dhimmi or a slave status, then you let them go their way. But understand that those latter verses replace the earlier verses, so these are the ones that the Muslims are operating under. Then, as I said, we talk about Muhammad's life as a pattern for all to follow. And we talked about that peace treaty in Hudaybiyah, when he led an army of 1,400 to attack Mecca, but he could not conquer Mecca at the time. So he entered into a 10-year peace deal, which he broke in 2 years, and came back with an army of 10,000 and slaughtered and leveled Mecca. Well, that's the same pattern they follow now. And I showed you last week how even Yasser Arafat and Nasser of Egypt actually quoted this in their defense when they were making peace agreements with Israel, stating, remember Hudaybiyah. And then, of course, lying. I love this quote because it reveals everything you need to know. Speaking is a means to achieve objectives. If a praiseworthy aim is attainable through both telling the truth and lying, then you shouldn't lie because there's no need for it. But when it is possible to achieve such an aim by lying and not by telling the truth, then it's permissible to lie if the goal is only permissible, and you're obliged to lie if the goal is obligatory. Whether the purpose is war, settling a disagreement, or gaining the sympathy of a victim legally entitled to retaliate against one so that he will forbear to do so, it is not unlawful to lie when any of these aims can be attained only through lying. And then, of course, we'll close with this slide. Elijah Abraham, who's been in our church, in fact, he's a missionary that we currently support. Elijah made this statement, which I thought just nailed it. Islam is not a religion. Islam is a socio-political system that uses a deity to advance its agenda of global conquest. Jesus did not die for Islam. Islam is a satanic ideology, but Muslims are people who need Jesus. So in summary, remember, Muhammad failed as a prophet, but was wildly successful as the king of Arabia. Islam is a theocracy, and there is no separation from Islam and Sharia. If you profess to be a Muslim, you must adhere to Sharia if you are a Muslim in good standing. And as we talked about last week, Sharia is not compatible with the U.S. Constitution because Sharia is a constitution in and of itself. And of course, their stated goal is to fight the unbelievers until there is no more unbelief and the world will be under Allah's reign alone. So that is our 5-part study on Islam. We barely scratched the surface. However, you have a basic working knowledge now. You should be able to grade a good C or maybe even a B minus if you were to take a test on the subject of Islam and you know more than 95% of all other Americans know. So we may add to it at some point in time, but that's given you enough to be functional in the day and age in which we live.